What's going on, A-Push people? This is Mr. M. This is our second spring break lecture. This is on American society in the 1920s. And let's get going without further ado. Wow, the 1920s, what an amazing time, an exciting time, a kind of a record-breaking time, when fast-paced, a lot of things going on, especially within the cities. Country life a little more rural, a little more quiet, still a little more traditional, which leads to a lot of conflict between the groups in those two areas over this particular era, this particular decade. So again, we start obviously coming out of World War I. A lot of unhappiness and frustration after World War I. A lot of people, I think, believed that the war was going to result in greater things for the United States, and obviously that's not going to be the case in the eyes of many American groups. Anyways, before we start, this is kind of cool. It's important when we understand to talk about, nativism or radical anti-radicalism or Red Scares, what we're talking about here. So politically, people are divided into four categories: radicals. Conservatives are on the opposite sides. Radicals usually would be groups like communists and anarchists. Conservatives are on the other side. The most extreme conservatives are called reactionaries. We would call them like fascists. And then further towards the middle, less extreme, they hold less extreme views, and they agree a little bit more with one another on some issues. Are liberals and conservatives, and then in between them would be moderates, who are middle of the road, middle ground folks right there. Anyways, it shows you kind of the political spectrum. When we say to the left, we mean in that direction. If you politically are to the left, you're a progressive or a liberal, two terms for the same thing. And then, of course, if you hold even more extreme views, for instance, like super progressivism or super extreme liberalism, then you fall into the radical, which includes socialists, and then even more extreme would be communists, and then even more extreme from them would be anarchists on the absolute left. And then on the right, it would be conservatives, and then as you move further, more extreme, more government control, I think you could say it would be reactionary. Anyways, so when we talk about anti-radicalism, we're talking about groups over here that are targeted usually by conservatives who are on the other side. Traditionally, Republicans fall in these categories. They fall in conservatism, I should say, and Democrats fall here, all right? And so when we say left, oftentimes that means Democrats in this country. When we say rights, that means conservatives. Okay, anyways, I think it's important. And by the way, what are their differences? Well, radicals believe there should be drastic revolutionary change in your government and society. Anarchists believe in kind of no government in control. Communists believe in a communist government in charge where the people, the workers, are in control. Socialists believe, of course, that it's the least extreme, it's the least radical. It believes, remember, that some industries ought to be controlled or owned by the government. Liberals believe the government should be improving people's lives, actively working to improve people's lives. Conservatives obviously support freedom of speech. They tend to support greater individual liberties and less government protection or involvement in your lives. And then, of course, reactionaries almost want to see society go backwards. They want to see almost like the KKK or the Nazi Party, they want to see a country return to a previous era, which they associate with greatness, which often means the exclusion of other populations that have arrived since that time. We talk about this because there's a period of anti-radicalism, also known as Americanism or nativism. Now, it's always called nativism, but in this era, it was referred to as Americanism in particular. And it started with a Red Scare. Remember, a Red Scare is an anti-communist paranoia or hysteria that sweeps across the country. They're usually short-lived. There's usually some spark that triggers them, and then they usually die out very quickly as well. They kind of come quickly, and then they die out quickly. That's kind of the nature of these sorts of hysterias. That was the case with the Salem witch trials. And it's going to be the case not only with this Red Scare, but with the big one, the one that most people know, the one that occurs in the 1940s and 50s. All right? So anyways, what was the trigger? The trigger was the Bolshevik Revolution. We had a communist revolution in Russia, and a lot of Americans were worried that communism would spread into the United States. That is the goal of communists, is to spread their movement all over the world. And so naturally, logically, they're going to try to spread it into the United States. And of course, many Americans were fearful of that. In addition to that, there were many strikes. Remember, 6,000 during the war, and many, including huge strikes after the war. A lot of businesses and government leaders believed these strikes were radical, or that radicals were organizing them, controlling them, provoking them, and that the entire labor movement had become too radical, that it was filled with too many communists and socialists that were pushing all workers to be more radical, which could cause mass riots and chaos in the future. So strikes occurred. It was, of course, because of inflation during the war. A lot of it is related to job competition after the war. All right. And now we go into kind of a list of all of these strikes that are going to provoke this Americanism that exists. All right. So we go first off to the Seattle General Strike. Did I skip one? No, not at all. And it starts with the Seattle General Strike. Now, there were strikes all over. We just highlight some of the big ones. Seattle General Strike, all the workers in Seattle struck at one time. It was peaceful. However, the mayor portrayed it as radicalized and was able to get federal troops sent in because he lied kind of to the authorities and told them that it was much more radical than it actually was. Eventually, that strike was defeated. Boston police strike. All the police officers who were not unionized at the time went on strike at the same time. What did the governor do? He fired all of them. That's what this image, by the way, is portraying. It's portraying the governor at the time, Calvin Coolidge, firing all the police officers. And then he hired new workers to replace them. And so the strike was broken that way. All of those that were involved lost their jobs and were replaced with others. So you're noticing something. We've got huge strikes. We've got a lot of strikes, and very few of them are successful. That's because business and government are going to work together here in the late 1910s and early 1920s. And we have a massive steel strike. This is going to be located on page 3 of your notes. It's called the Great Steel Strike. September of 1919, the American Federation of Labor tried to bring the steel workers into their union. U.S. Steel refused to negotiate with them, portrayed the union as communist and radical. After a whole lot of violence between the workers and the company's kind of agents or guards, federal and state troops were called in, and the strike was broken. Again, notice in this image in the bottom right-hand part of the screen, the steel strike, or those involved in the steel strike are holding up a red flag, right? Red is the symbol of communism or radicalism. So what are businesses and the media doing during this time? They're working together to portray the American worker as radical, as socialist or communist or anarchist, as too radical for the country. And they're trying to get the American public, and successfully so, to not support labor efforts, to not support strikes, because these are strikes by radicals, not by regular, average, everyday Americans. The United Mine Workers also strike during this era. Led by John L. Lewis, he becomes the new face of the labor movement in this country, kind of over time, replacing Samuel Gompers. They want shorter hours, they want higher wages. Eventually, the Attorney General was able to get injunctions to stop the strikes. Clearly, the government and business and the media are working actively against labor during this time because of the frequency of strikes and because of their association with radicalism. What's the next real spark, I guess you could say, of this Red Scare? Well, it's these Palmer raids as well. So, of course, what happens is A. Mitchell Palmer is the Attorney General. He's like the top cop, I guess you could say, in the government. He's the top federal law enforcement agent. There were a series of bombings across the country. They bombed high-profile people, and a lot of the bombs were sent through the mail. One of the bombs exploded outside A. Mitchell Palmer's residence. He was outraged. He was furious that he and his family were targeted, even though nobody was actually killed. And so he went to Congress and he asked for $500,000 to root out who he thought was responsible for this. Radicals inside the United States, like anarchists and socialists and communists, who he believed were targeting wealthy and powerful members of business and the government in an effort to try to harm them. So anyways, Congress gave him the money. And what he did is he then took this money and he implemented a number of anti-radical policies across the United States with it. For instance, to start out, cities started to require teachers to take loyalty oaths, anti-communist loyalty oaths to the United States. And he claimed that groups like anarchists and Bolsheviks and Wobblies were radical and needed to be broken up. He claimed that there would be violence at future events against Americans. And then he started to round up suspected radicals, many of whom were deported from the United States to Russia, despite the fact that a lot of these folks were American citizens who were never technically given their due process. They were rounded up, declared radicals, suspected or otherwise, and gotten rid of. In fact, the American Legion, which is a group of veterans, a veterans group in this country, actually worked with the government to round up suspected radicals and to turn them into the government. Not only did they deport, and first off, you got to take a look at this awesome image, right? This is a cartoon that is supporting Palmer and supporting these raids. It's a Red Scare image that is saying, yes, communists and radicals are a threat to our country. Here's the American flag. Who's trying to sneak under it, almost like sneaking into the country or sneaking under the border? This radical, right? He's got reds across his hat, symbol of communism. He's got Bolshevism with his knife. He's got the fire, the flames of anarchy that he's bringing with him. And he's about to bring them into the United States. What's the title? Put them out and keep them out, right? Talking about immigrants, because all immigrants are radical as far as this cartoonist is concerned. Here's another one, the gauntlet flung down. When one knight in medieval times wanted to challenge another to a duel, or when a person wanted to challenge another to a duel, they threw their glove down on the ground in front of them. It was like a super insult. So what is this? This is the government. This is a government building. What have the anarchists done? They've thrown their glove down on the ground, almost like we're challenging the government for control. And what does the government glove have in hand? It has a bomb, right, with murder across it. So the message is these bombings are a challenge by the anarchists, by the radicals in this country, to see if the U.S. government has control and is able to respond to this threat or not. And so this is again stating, hey, the U.S. government needs to get involved. We need to break up these radicals. In January of 1919, 5,000 communists were arrested from 33 cities. Palmer and his agents would conduct raids. That's why they call them the Palmer raids, where they would raid homes or businesses where communists or other radicals lived and worked. They would round these people up. They would arrest them, and oftentimes they would convict them, or I should say just deport them, even without a conviction. Again, 550 of these people were deported to Russia, which was experiencing a communist revolution. Many were U.S. citizens. Interestingly enough, this might seem horrific to us. This might seem like a basic, violation of people's rights. Almost all Americans agreed with Palmer's actions because the Red Scare was so pervasive. Americans believed there was this communist threat. It was here, and we had to do something about it, or our very country's livelihood was at stake. Interestingly enough, the Red Scare ended quickly in the summer of 1920. Palmer had promised there would be a number of riots and attacks in the summer of 1920. They never materialized. When that happened, Americans kind of lost faith in Palmer and kind of lost faith that the Red Scare was as bad as he pretended. Despite that, conservatives used the Red Scare to break up unions. They were able to portray them as radical, as violent, as anarchists, and they were able to really get the government and the public to start to oppose unions again. Which is going to harm the labor movement in this country. AFL lost 25% of its membership. Next example of after the Palmer raids of nativism is Sacco and Vanzetti's trial. Very famous case that occurred, and it started with two Italian atheist anarchist draft dodgers. So, wow, we talk about a label. They were Italians, they were atheists, they were anarchists, they were draft dodgers. That right there made them different than most Americans, and especially different than traditional WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, who valued religion and who didn't care for immigrants, and who certainly didn't like radicals like anarchists, and especially were unfriendly to people that dodged the draft, that didn't show up when they were supposed to. Anyways, these immigrants were convicted of a murder in 1921. The reality was there was essentially no evidence, physical evidence, to tie them to the murders. A lot of folks believe that they were not actually guilty, or that they were basically convicted based on their beliefs, not based on the actual evidence. The jury and judge clearly were affected by prejudices against immigrants and against radicals. Again, there was no conclusive evidence at all that they had committed the murder, although some people do believe that they probably might have. Sacco and Vanzetti, nonetheless, were found guilty. There was a highly publicized appeals process that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Eventually, to the state Supreme Court. Eventually, they were executed. A lot of folks believed innocent people had been executed. There were mass rallies, some in the country, a lot overseas, in Italy, in Japan, all over the world. People protested what they thought was an unjust killing by the United States. Here we go. Great cartoon called Have a Chair, right? And it's an electric chair where they electrocuted people who were being put to death. And what this is doing is it's comparing what happened to Sacco and Vanzetti, this Red Scare, this paranoia, this witch hunt of the 1920s. They're comparing it to the Salem witch trials of the 1690s, which of course was also based on hysteria and fear and paranoia without any evidence. Here's another one. Is this the emblem? This is supposed to be the Statue of Liberty, but the statue's been replaced by an electric chair, and it's asking the country and the public, are we willing to accept that this is now the emblem for the rest of the world of the United States after what we just did, this horrible atrocity we committed by executing them? A third example of nativism that occurred in the 1920s was this group, the reemergence of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. They come back and they become larger than ever. They're huge. They not only are large in the South, they spread into the Southwest, they spread into the Midwest, like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana. They are a national organization. They spread all throughout Orange County. They spread into Fullerton and Anaheim. They had 5 million members. Public members, people who proudly displayed their Klan membership. They carried cards. They became a much more accepted and acceptable organization. What helped them to come back? Well, actually a very famous movie by one of America's greatest directors, one of our pioneers of the movie industry, a guy named D.W. Griffith, who also happened to be a horrific racist. He directed a 3-hour epic-length movie, the first epic movie in American history, the first 3-hour. And what it did is it glorified and glamorized the KKK. It portrayed them as knights of the South, defending themselves from horrible Union soldiers and angry black mobs. It really caused a lot of Americans to see the movie and to become interested in the KKK and to want to become part of the KKK because of the propaganda that was used to display them in such a heroic way against these black villains. The KKK came back and it was incredibly nativist. It wasn't just anti-black anymore because it wasn't just located in the South. They were opposed to basically anybody that was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So wasn't a white Protestant from Germany or England. For instance, they opposed any immigrant other than English speakers. They opposed all Catholics. They opposed Jews. They opposed communists. That would include socialists and anarchists. They opposed blacks. They opposed anybody that bootlegged, which meant illegally sold alcohol. They opposed gambling, adultery, birth control, anybody who used it or who tried to get others to use it. These were all people that needed to be gotten rid of in society. They were targets. Basically, they wanted America to go back to a more traditional, slow-moving, conservative life without these groups who the KKK believed were changing society too rapidly. Incredibly pro-WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, opposed to anything that was considered modern or diverse, ultra-conservative, extremist, racist. That's a reactionary group. They rose to incredible popularity in the 1920s, and just like that, they kind of go down real quickly. Why? There was a real scandal in Indiana involving a KKK leader who was arrested for murder and sexual abuse. More importantly, they were investigated because they were embezzling money from their members. The Klan lost its respect, it lost its moral high ground, and it eventually died down. People dropped out of it in droves. And it kind of dropped down back into an underground organization again. But look at how powerful and prominent they were, marching right down the Pennsylvania Avenue where the White House is located in mass numbers, showing their strength and their political power. Other examples of nativism in the 1920s. Well, first off, nice little review here for you at this spot in the notes. Nativism as it existed, it started with the Know-Nothings in the 1850s. We should know who they are. It includes anti-Asian sentiments beginning with California and the Chinese Exclusion Act, American Protective Association, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, the Gentleman's Agreement. Remember, we now forbid Japanese immigration, World War I, anti-German sentiments, and of course the KKK in the 1910s and 20s. So a long history of nativism really dating back to our first waves of immigrants coming into the United States. Many in the United States, especially rural areas, believed immigration was eroding what had traditionally made us great, what they call American values. They thought that we were losing our English tradition, our Christian tradition, and that we were embracing foreign customs and traditions that they thought were taking away our Americanness. And so, in response to this, conservatives and many rural Americans were able to support anti-immigration laws, laws that restricted immigration into the United States. Started with the 1921 Immigration Act. It ended open immigration, where we accepted everybody, and it set a limit, 350,000 per year, and no more than 3% from any one specific ethnic group. They went back to the 1910 census, when Eastern and Southern European, to figure out the numbers, the percentages, when Eastern and Southern European immigrant numbers were lower. All right, so it was intentionally designed to reduce the number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants and to reduce immigration as a whole. Here we go. What are they doing? They're funneling immigration, right? This is in support of these immigration restrictions. It's called the only way to handle it. In Europe, you have these masses of immigrants that are trying to get into the United States. Uncle Sam's going to funnel them off and going to cut them off at 3% and only let in a handful, a trickle. What this cartoonist would argue is a sensible amount, because letting in the hordes, as he has them portrayed back there, was overwhelming the United States. 3 years after the 1921 Act, Congress passed an even harsher and more strict act called the National Origins Act. This is the one you need to know. It set a maximum number of immigrants into the U.S. at 152,000. That's nothing, folks. And no more than any 2% from any ethnic group already in the U.S. They went all the way back to the 1890 census to try to figure out how many Eastern and Southern Europeans they were here. Because, of course, there were way less at that census than there were in the ones that came after, so that they could set the 2% number even lower for Eastern and Southern Europeans to essentially cut them off completely. Asians were banned completely. Canadians and Hispanics were allowed to continue to come in. They were exempted because we knew we needed both of them to pump our economy in the future. The Immigration Act was cut in half in 1929, so again, we cut it even further. And by 1931, we actually had more foreigners coming into this country than arrived. By 1929, I should say by 1931, more foreigners were actually leaving the U.S. than were arriving. We institute what are called quotas with these acts. Only X amount of people from this country are getting in, and only this many total. It's called a quota system. That was the law of the land all the way till the 1960s, 1965. We're going to have the same quota system in place. All right. So again, foreign-born immigrant populations in the U.S. going to go way down beginning in the 1920s because of these massive immigration restrictions. And let's face it, there's nothing really more nativist than anti-immigration laws. All right. Other examples of what we would call traditionalism or nativism, the Scopes trial Also known as the monkey trial. This was the first kind of high publicity trial that captured the attention of the nation. It's carried on radio in a lot of places. There were a lot of news people that were there kind of writing about it or recording on the radio about it. And what it was about was this. It was really a fight between rural America and whether rural American values were going to be dominant or whether we were going to embrace modern ideas and science and move away from a more traditional religious view of the world. And so it's really kind of more of a story of the fight between the city and the rural America. Cities were rapidly changing. Rural America was trying to resist some of that change. So, first off, in many southern states, including Tennessee, there's a lot of what we call religious fundamentalists. Folks that have a very strict interpretation of Christianity and take it literally. And they tend to vote more based on religious basis than other groups. And one thing that they disagreed with was was evolution. So they passed a law that said in Tennessee you could only teach creationism. It was illegal to teach evolution. What happened was a science teacher did so. He was brought up on charges. And supporters of his, led by a group of attorneys that fight for civil rights called the American Civil Liberties Union, they sued and argued that this was unconstitutional, that he had a right to teach evolution over creationism. It became known as the monkey trial, of course, because the whole idea of evolution is that perhaps we descended from a missing link, which may have been like a primate, a monkey-like character. And so this turned into this huge sensationalized trial that the public was captivated by, kind of to see who would win, but really to see which side would win, which group in America. Would we kind of accept, like the rest of the world, that kind of these new ideas were dominant and move away from our traditional history. This is a famous image kind of making fun of the trial, right? There's the monkey dancing around like it's a circus because kind of the trial was. Clarence Darrow, a famous attorney, defended Scopes. William Jennings Bryan, the old presidential nominee, the rural American, the guy that represented rural America and our traditional values of the farmer. He represented the prosecution, represented the state of Tennessee. Ultimately, it seemed like fundamentalism and our traditional way of life were put on trial. Darrow actually put Bryan on the stand at one point. Bryan seemed to contradict some of his fundamentalist views. Ultimately, the state of Tennessee still found Scopes guilty and sentenced him to a small fine. But in the eyes of a lot of the public and experts, the people that were paying attention, it almost seemed like modernism got the best of fundamentalism. Anyways, we're going to move on to Prohibition, which in some ways is another example of nativism or anti-immigration as well. Prohibition, of course, is the last of the major progressive reforms. It's the biggest. Of course, what happened, it was supported obviously heavily by churches and women, right? Reformers and religious groups. It was very popular in the South and the Midwest, obviously not as popular on the East Coast in cities where there were larger immigrant populations who were more predisposed to use it. After we passed the 18th Amendment that banned alcohol, the sale, the production, or the consumption, we passed the Volstead Act to enforce it. We established, for instance, the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Department, to send out agents to enforce the law to make sure that people were not creating, buying, or selling, or consuming alcohol. Prohibition was obviously opposed by a lot of folks in eastern cities. If you supported Prohibition, you supported dry laws. If you opposed them, you tended to support wet laws. The biggest problem with Prohibition, it was almost impossible to enforce. About half the public was completely opposed to Prohibition. Another large percentage was willing to allow it at some of the time. There were not enough enforcement officials. There was alcohol still all over this country. A lot of it was being illegally produced, which means it can be harmful or hazardous. It was still available by a doctor's prescription, and many people were able to get it that way. It was necessary for industrial uses still, and so people were able to smuggle it through that. Homemade alcohol became huge business in this country. It led to the rise of organized crime and organized criminals whose job it was to produce and then move or sell these incredibly profitable alcohol products. They were called bootleggers because they would, for instance, hide them in the legs of the pant legs of their legs of their pants. Al Capone and others developed huge, powerful gangster networks throughout American cities where they fought with each other over who controlled the sale of alcohol there. It led to incredible amounts of violence by gangs in the cities. A lot of times these were racial or ethnic gangs, like Italians against Jews, for instance, or Russians. It led to racial conflict. It led to gang violence, corruption, greed, murders of political officials, bombings, and just all these problems that people didn't anticipate when the 18th Amendment was passed. Bribery of all government levels who looked the other way so that alcohol could be bought and sold still. Organized criminals started to spread into other things like prostitution, gambling, and narcotics, and made those major issues in the country as well. All of this because Prohibition kind of led to this. It led to the rise of speakeasies, which were secret bars that were usually hidden in people's basements, in their homes, or maybe underneath their businesses. A lot of times it was real, respectable businesses that were actually fronts. If you said a secret word or a password, or knew the right person, you could get in through the back door into the speakeasy, which was like a private bar that was operated in secret with music, with alcohol, with all the excitement, I guess you could say, of the nightlife, even though they were all technically supposed to be illegal at the time. Speakeasies were very popular with the middle class, especially in cities, because they were easily accessible. They were especially popular with women who were welcome, as opposed to saloons and other bars. As opposed to saloons and other bars where women had not been accepted prior to that. In fact, saloons started to disappear, which had been all male, and those are legal bars, by the way. And so a lot of immigrants actually struggled more to get alcohol than they had before. Americans became used to breaking the law. It was common. People did it all the time, especially wealthier groups. People looked the other way. It wasn't a big deal. Eventually, because of all the problems, because it wasn't working, we were still drinking, and it led to all these extra problems, like gangsterism. Prohibition is going to be repealed in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. Easy way to remember 21st Amendment. You got to be 21 to drink. So when we passed the 21st Amendment, we made it okay for the country to drink again after 21. Absolute consumption of alcohol went way down during the 1920s, but way back up, obviously, afterwards. Again, you see a drop in alcohol consumption. Though look at 22, 23, 24, 25. It's still way up there. People were still drinking, even though it was technically illegal. All right. Money spent on distilled spirits, on alcohol sales. Look at this. Actually, during Prohibition, it was actually higher than at any other time. People were spending more money on alcohol because it was more expensive than ever before. Changing directions. We became a mass business, mass consumer, mass production economy during this time. This is when we started to use advertising. This is when we started really to produce consumer goods, goods that could be used and consumed in the home on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. This is when we start producing goods for the public, like you do in grocery stores. This is when we start to see all of these things emerge. It all happens because of mass production. And it all happens because business was glorified during these years. In the 20s, business was king. It was God. It was what was important. And business was really glamorized and glorified. Most famous example, very popular book, The Man Nobody Knows, really portrayed Jesus as the first real businessman, the first modern businessman. Calvin Coolidge, our president. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships at the temple. Literally, your boss is your God. Your work is your church, and you are the worshiper. That's talking about considering business to be popular or important. Good Lord. The economy absolutely boomed in the early parts of the 1920s. The U.S. became the largest creditor after World War I, so we had loaned tons of money during the war. Now those countries have to pay us off. There was a recession after the war, but that slowed down. And the conservative presidents of the 1920s enacted what becomes known as trickle-down tax policies. They favored the wealthy. Wealthy people get major cuts. That's interestingly enough what President Trump's trying to do. Massive tax cuts. They're going to have a lot more wealth for themselves to invest in their companies or to invest in new companies. Why is that good? Because that wealth trickles down to the rest of us in the form of new jobs at the companies that the wealthy people own that we all work at. So the whole idea of trickle-down economics is to benefit the wealthy, and those benefits eventually trickle down to the rest of us through lower-cost products or more jobs and high-paying jobs. The guy who created it was a dude named Andrew Mellon. And so those policies are going to give us a massive boost of wealth that is going to be invested into the economy in the 20s. In addition to that, credit becomes popular during this era. The slogan, buy now, pay later, becomes a mainstay. Americans, for the first time ever, are given large amounts of credit, and they begin to buy consumer goods like toasters, for instance, and oftentimes they bought them on credit, and they worried about paying them later on. There is a major rise in industrial productivity. We had way more goods produced than ever before. We're mass producing them. We're using machines. We're using assembly lines. We have way more that are available, including new goods, modern goods. Wages were at an all-time high at this era as well, because a lot of the goods we're producing are considered high-tech goods that the rest of the world wants as well. Electrical power increased 1,900% between 1912 and 2029. We became an electric-powered country almost, I would want to say overnight, but within about 15 years. We have all these new technologies, electric motors that allow us to power machines, bigger machines, power them longer, faster. Assembly lines that allow us to mass produce goods, where you have workers lined up to focus on producing one part of the process, which massively increases your efficiency and allows you to produce faster than ever before. We have new industries that develop, like light metals and plastics, like synthetics. We have the movie industry, the radio industry, the automobile industry. All of these are brand new industries that emerge in the 20s that are like shots of adrenaline into the American economy. It is a good time to be alive. You better enjoy it in the 20s because it's all going to come to a crashing halt by the end. The construction industry just absolutely boomed. Not only is our population going up, but skyscrapers and these new modern buildings are being built, bridges, as well, infrastructure. We have medical breakthroughs where people are living longer than ever before. The iron lung is a good example of a breakthrough, which was essentially like a respirator. All of these things happening at the same time. Boy, oh boy, good time to be alive if you are an American. And of course, businesses are allowed to consolidate again. Remember, all the antitrust laws were no longer enforced because we have conservatives in power. So big businesses merge, they consolidate, they go and get even bigger, so that the top 200 corporations in the world hold half of the country's wealth. Chain stores became commonplace. Mom and pop individual stores start to die out. We start to see these massive chain stores, including shopping malls, Woolworths, Sears, and Roebuck. If you're familiar with Sears, you're probably familiar with them. Woolworth and Roebuck were like Sears. They're just died out. They're gone now. But they were some of our earliest department stores, places like, Macy's and Nordstrom's today. All right. New white-collar workers. Hey, we started to develop white-collar jobs. Those are jobs where you don't work with your hands as a manual labor with a workman's uniform. It's where you wear a white shirt and tie to work every day. And so they're business jobs. They're office jobs. By 1930, 44% of workers are working in these new fields, these white-collar jobs. So they're not producing as much anymore. They're working in the office, which becomes considered the ideal. Manual labor jobs go up as well, but white-collar jobs are where most Americans are getting their jobs. There's an increase in consumers' goods, and so we needed advertising. We needed salespeople. We needed people to work the stock market and banks. That's where a lot of these folks ended up working. Women also entered the workforce in the 20s. The middle-class women took jobs as typists and secretaries or teachers. Shop clerks oftentimes as well, or cashiers or switchboard operators. A lot of times, unfortunately, immigrants were forced to work as kind of servants, domestic servants, maids, cleaners instead. Advertising became huge business during this era. It becomes a big business. Manufacturers tapped into advertising. It became a billion-dollar industry. Advertisers were almost always white men, college-educated men. Magazines had advertisements. Newspapers started to use them. The radio was big. Sports, for the first time, became huge business and an opportunity to sell products as well. Some of our first great American heroes were sports figures who had been pumped up to legendary status by advertising companies. Babe Ruth, the hero of baseball, the Sultan of SWAT. Jack Dempsey, the famous American boxer. They become some of our first great cultural heroes and icons in this country. There's Ruth, there's Dempsey, two sports icons in this country. Scientific management is developed during this era as well. This is on page 10 of yours. Looks like we jumped over welfare capitalism. Scientific management is an idea developed by a guy named Frederick Taylor. He developed the assembly line. He says if you produce your product on an assembly line, rather than having one person produce everything, it'll increase speed and productivity. You'll lower cost, which means you make more profit on your products. He wrote it in a book, The Principles of Scientific Management. The auto industry, led by Henry Ford, embraced his ideas before others. They became filthy rich as a result of it. It completely revolutionized how goods were produced. Workers hated it. They called it Taylorism. They hated doing the same job over and over and over again. They hated not being able to build a car, only being able to build one area of it, because that made them more expendable. It took away their skills. It made them unskilled workers. It made them really dependent on the company rather than their own individual abilities. Ford became kind of a legend in the United States, and especially in the auto industry, which becomes the largest in the 1920s. The biggest industry in the country becomes automobiles. Detroit becomes the center of the automobile world. Ford realized workers were not just workers. They were tools and consumers. So, for instance, what did he do in 1914? He raised his wages from $2 to $5 for workers. If they agreed to adopt thrifty habits, that meant habits like they wouldn't drink, so that they would be at work more. They'd be more productive. He thought a healthy, productive worker would be better for his company. He paid good benefits. He hired handicapped workers. He hired convicts, giving them a second chance. He hired immigrants, as long as they agreed to follow his rules, which were very, very, I would say, kind of strict. Many people in his, many business owners considered him a traitor. Many wealthy Americans did. They thought he was too generous, that he was giving in too much to the working class, that he was making it hard for other businesses to compete or keep pace. The assembly line was revolutionary. It had previously required a company 14 hours to build a car. With the assembly line, they were making them every 1.5 hours. And again, how did it work? Well, I think one car every 10 seconds was coming off an assembly line. And the car that was most popular, of course, was the Model T. This was the mass-produced car. There were more Model Ts than any other car on the road, and it wasn't a lot of selection. So you saw literally 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 cars. 2 out of 3 cars were Model Ts during this era. By 1930, they were cheap. They were mass-produced thanks to the assembly line. They were affordable. Americans could buy them. There were 30 million cars, and 20 million of them on the road were Model Ts. That's how an assembly line worked. There were lines that were set up, tracks. The car started as nothing, just kind of 4 tires. And each worker along the way did one thing. For instance, one worker would put the right tire on, one would put the left on. As the car moved along, the next sets of workers would put on the engine chassis. The next sections, they're putting on the hood and the windows until eventually, by the end of this long assembly line on this long flat factory, on each assembly line there was a finished car at the end, and it was ready to be sent for sale. Ford, as revolutionary and amazing an owner as he was, we got to take some bad with him as well. He was known for his anti-Semitism, his anti-Jewish beliefs. In fact, he published a lot of those in a journal known as the International Jew that he helped finance and bankroll. And he was an admirer of Adolf Hitler. So we do have to accept the fact he was also very anti-Semitic. Nothing was more revolutionary in the 20s than the automobile. Replaced steel, became the new leading industry in this country. Many other industries like rubber emerged as a result of the car, right? Because we needed rubber for tires. Glass, obviously for the windshields, became a big industry. Fabrics, because we needed the interiors, lined with fabric. Gas stations, garages, highway construction. Hey, these industries were minor or non-existent before the car. That's why the automobile was so massively important, because it not only became the leading industry in our country that we produced these goods, but all these other industries benefited as well. U.S. standard of living improved tremendously during this era, so our money's going further. You're able to buy more with your money than ever before. We had more leisure time. We had more time off. Now we can spend it on the road. Suburbs are going to emerge where housing communities are going to be located towards the outer edges of town, because now people can commute with their cars. If cars benefit, if the auto industry booms and buses and trucks start to emerge as well, the railroad industry suffered. They couldn't compete with cars. More and more traffic and production is sent by car. People stopped using railroads as passengers, trains, and especially because of cars, but also buses, also airplanes. And so the railroad industry suffered enormously in the 20s. They went from a position of incredible strength and power in the 1800s down to one where they were destroyed in the 1920s. Social changes. Women became less dependent on men because of the automobile. Home life changed. The youth became more independent because now they have more outside of the home experience thanks to the automobile. Regions of the country become less isolated and start to become settled, like the Southwest. Phoenix, Arizona, places like that are going to start to grow. Southern California is going to start to grow. Buses mean that you can consolidate schools or churches. We're going to see them become massively large because now buses can relocate people to those schools or churches for their services. Also, you should know traffic was horrific in some places, and auto accidents and crashes were devastating. There were mass fatalities and accidents. In fact, by 1951, more people had died on the road than in all wars we had fought. Other major transportation innovations: the airplane. In 1903, the Wright brothers fly the first flight. Yes, it only lasted 12 seconds, but whatever. They got into the air. Good job, Orville and Wilbur. The airplane was used in World War I. It really became revolutionary. In the 1920s, our first passenger lines emerged, where airplanes were transporting people, usually just a couple. The major achievement in air travel was Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot and American hero. He flew the first solo plane across the Atlantic, proving that it could be done. That was a major achievement. Of course, he was followed by Amelia Earhart, the famous aviator, as well, in 1932. All of these are groundbreaking, revolutionary things showing the impact or the power that the airplane could have on the future of society. Civilization became more closely linked because of the airplane. Great distances no longer seemed nearly as great, not only within this country but overseas. Railroads take another hit. Now they got another competitor that they can't really keep up with. Airplanes were used in World War I effectively for war and for transport of goods and people during times of peace. The radio becomes massively important in this era as well. It was invented way back in the 1890s. The first American radio station was KDKA in Pittsburgh in 1920. It really only had the radius of a couple of blocks. That's as far as it broadcast. They grew incredibly quickly, and they were able to broadcast their signals so much further in just a couple of years. Our first national radio networks were NBC and CBS. They started as radio companies before they developed into television networks. The impact, thousands of people had jobs in the industry. It entertained millions during our leisure time. Remember, we had more leisure time. Sports were broadcast. News was broadcast. Politics. Kids, stories like sitcoms, like Little Orphan Annie, Superman. These are incredibly popular shows. Detective shows. All of these were designed to entertain the family, to bring the family together and to listen to the radio, to be entertained. Advertising is massive as well. We become more nationally close-knit. We develop an American identity. Radio really influences, and advertisers do, what it means to be American. Sporting events become profitable. Politics becomes much more active. More people get their news from the radio than ever before. Even classical radio gets a hit as well. The movie industry emerged in the 20s and becomes incredibly profitable as well. Hold on, we got the television on. Mr. M, pause. Movies became a major industry. They had started in the 1890s with like what are called peep show penny arcades. That's where you'd put like a little coin in the machine. It would lower a screen and you could watch a short little piece of a movie, usually just a short clip of it, maybe a few minutes. By 1903, we had our first real moving picture. It was called The Great Train Robbery. It was exactly as it was described, the story of a group of bandits that rob a train. I mentioned our first full-length feature movie, which was a 3-hour-long movie, was Birth of a Nation, the movie that glorified the Klan. I should mention, by the way, a lot of the time they would use white actors dressed up to be looking like black, to look black, in order to kind of portray them the way that they wanted to, I guess is a good way of saying that. Let me go back to my main screen. Movies got a huge boost during the war. A lot of anti-German propaganda. Remember the 4-minute clips that were used by Charlie Chaplin and others to spread anti-German propaganda. Hollywood becomes the center of the movie industry. The weather helped. You could film 365 days a year. Silent movies were what was made all the way until 1927. There was no volume. They didn't have the technology yet. By 1927, we finally developed what becomes known as talking movies or talking pictures, nicknamed talkies. The first was The Jazz Singer. It was the story of an African-American jazz singer. Yes, again, this is a white guy, a Jew named Al Jolson, who they had painted up in what is called blackface to make him look black rather than hire an actual black actor. All right. Impact of movies, they become the most popular of all forms of entertainment. They surpass radio, music, theater. They become a part of American society more than any of those things. They employed hundreds of thousands of Americans, not only in the industry, but also actors and actresses become some of our most popular and influential figures in this country. Again, it standardized American culture, what actors said, how they spoke, what they wore. Their mannerisms become copied and adopted and associated around the rest of the world with what it meant to be an American. They did also provide education. There were films, clips, news clips during times of war. There would be war films. There would be travel little clips where they would tell about parts of the world for people to visit. There were also tabloids and movie magazines that developed to encourage people to become more interested. Changes in working conditions. This is out of order in the notes, but it is in your notes. You got to go back a few pages to find it. So during this era, in order to defeat the size, I guess you could say, of unions, or the power of unions, businesses embarked on what becomes known as welfare capitalism. They did things to try to improve the conditions for workers, not paying them more, but trying to just improve the environment at work, to make environment more profitable, to make it more healthy, to make it more positive, to get the best out of their workers. So, for instance, there were sometimes reductions of work hours. That's why we had more leisure time. Americans didn't work as many hours as they had before. Some owners believed you should take care of your workers so that they wouldn't join labor unions or go on strike. And it would actually decrease the number of people that joined unions. And then this did occur during this era. Union membership went way down, because unions couldn't compete a lot of times with these offers that the businesses gave. So they would have things like, hey, they would have gyms on site. They would have maybe sick time. Maybe they would have a nursery for the children so that you didn't have to miss work for childcare. They would try all of these things to simply improve the livelihood, I should say the experience at the job, to make it more friendly to the workers, so the workers wouldn't feel a need to join a union. They might give them a little more vacation time. They might give them longer breaks, but they rarely, if ever, gave higher wages. All right. The 1920s social life, my goodness, it is a crazy time. It's a radical time, especially in the cities. More Americans lived in urban areas than rural areas for the first time ever. There was a sexual revolution. A lot of Americans became much more sexually open and active than ever before. Sexual promiscuity was common. I wouldn't say common, but it was much more out there and open than ever before, especially with young people. Drinking, not only for men, but definitely women, despite the fact it was illegal. Erotic dancing was common, although we wouldn't consider it too erotic. They sure did during that era. It was seen as provocative and extreme and radical and erotic. Flapper is a term we use to describe young women in their 20s who expressed the new free woman. They smoked, they drank openly, they cursed, they hung out with men in public settings. Some of them were sexually promiscuous. They dressed in flashy gear outfits that oftentimes showed a great deal of skin, which went back away from what the tradition had been during the Victorian era, where women covered up entirely. Here's flappers. Again, you're going to notice plunging necklines. They're going to be sleeveless dresses a lot of times, what are considered at knee-level dresses. All of these were seen. Short hair, lots of makeup. These were considered unfeminine or unwomanlike from previous eras. They're wearing colorful, flashy gear, modern, sleek-fitting clothing, and again, this represented the new modern woman in many American cities. Margaret Sanger is another early American women's rights activist. She pioneered birth control in this country. She published pamphlets that talked about birth control methods, talked about access to birth control, despite the fact that her pamphlets were illegal according to many laws in this country called the Comstock laws, anti-sexuality laws. She opened the first family planning clinic in this country. She founded the American Birth Control League. She wasn't able to really establish birth control as legal, I guess you could say, or publicly available in this era, although she's going to achieve it later on in life. Women did organize. Alice Paul, remember, she was the old leader of the Congressional Union. Now that they've won suffrage, Alice Paul leads what's called the National Women's Party. They fight for an equal rights amendment. It got close to being passed about 50 years after she started the effort, but it never actually became a part of American law. So she started it in the 20s. It's going to be revived in the 70s and nearly passed, but the women are never able to get an equal rights amendment passed into the Constitution because of a number of obstacles. The League of Women Voters formed in 1920 to try to get women to be more politically involved. Divorce laws were liberalized. It was easier for women to get divorces in bad relationships thanks to becoming more politically active. Many women stayed in the workforce after World War I, even though most were forced back into the home. Jazz became a very popular and influential type of music in the United States in the 1920s. It became popular after World War I. It really developed prior to the war. And where were its roots? Well, with most great American music, like the blues, like soul, like rock. They all developed based on African-influenced slave spirituals, songs, hymns that were performed on plantations. They grew into what we become known as Jubilee and blues in the South, and they develop over time into higher-paced, faster versions were called jazz music. It's black folk music. It contained common bodies of sound. One version of it was known as ragtime, which was super fast-paced. Our first ragtime composer was Scott Joplin. So again, the origins of jazz were on the plantation, just like blues. Faster kind of sounds and rhythms were adopted, and they became known as jazz, and even faster versions were called ragtime. The most famous jazz music group or area was called the New Orleans type of music, of jazz music, was New Orleans Dixieland jazz. Thanks to the Great Migration, where African Americans relocated to the North, they brought their jazz music with them, and it became popular in Chicago and Kansas City and New York City. Dixieland jazz, as it becomes known, group improvisation. So it's not set pieces. There's a lot of improvisation where people are doing what they want to do, and there are long solos where one improvising musician is able to play their instrument and improvise in a solo form while the others back him up. There's a lot of syncopation, which, as it's been described to me, is how the beat of the music works. And it's designed to be kind of intentionally off, I guess you could say, beat or rhythm in some instances. The tempo is moderate to fast. If it's fast all the way, it's ragtime. If it's slow, it would be blues. In the middle, it's jazz. Louis Armstrong was the great jazz master improviser. He was considered the greatest of the improvisationists who kind of just made it up as they went along. Again, jazz becomes incredibly popular in the North thanks to the Great Migration. There's Armstrong there in the bottom right. There's Armstrong and his Hot Five. You'll notice there are a lot of, at the time, jazz was mostly a mixed race. It was white and black. And it was also women were accepted into jazz as well. The Harlem Renaissance is a term also developed in the 1920s. It's a term to describe the development of African American culture in American cities, most famously Harlem, New York, which became the center or the heart of African American culture and society. Harlem became a black enclave, which meant it was a black neighborhood that grew massively after World War I, and it was responsible for the production of incredible amounts of African American poetry, literature, art, music, that uniquely and for the first time expressed pain and sorrow and discrimination and suffering that African Americans were feeling at this time in their history. Poets and writers that were associated with the movement: Langston Hughes is one of the most famous poets, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston. These are all just incredibly, massively important Harlem Renaissance writers who told the stories of what it meant to be African American, to suffer the pain and the discrimination and the hope of maybe it being different in the future. Powerful, incredible stuff. Langston Hughes is the most famous. And then, of course, those incredible jazz performers in Harlem. Duke Ellington performed at his club. It was called the Cotton Club. Kind of a joke or a play on the fact they previously had to, pick cotton in their past. He was a piano master. He was the leader of the band. He composed, he arranged. He too, along with Louis Armstrong, were considered the two most famous of the jazz musicians. Finally, African American politics in the 1920s becomes much more militant and angry and hostile against white society. It was led by a man named Marcus Garvey, and here he is. He was a leader of something called the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association. First, he supported a Back to Africa movement. He wanted African Americans to resettle or relocate back to Africa to get away from white society. He argued blacks would never be treated equally by whites. Even if they received freedom, they would never actually experience it on a day-to-day basis. They would never be considered equal by their white neighbors, and they ought to just leave. Later, he realized that was probably impossible to do, and so from that point forward, he advocated black racial pride and separatism. He argued that blacks should live separately from whites, should have their own black neighborhoods, their own black communities, their own black stores. Blacks should shop from blacks and associate with blacks and kind of separate themselves from white society rather than integrate into a society of people who, he argued, hated them. His views became the basis for Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. W.E.B. Du Bois becomes the basis for Martin Luther King's views. Marcus Garvey becomes the basis for Malcolm X. Finally, the Lost Generation is a literary movement that emerges after World War I. It was white writers who emerged and formed kind of a group, a friendship. They were very pessimistic. There were works that were resentful and pessimistic. They felt like they'd been betrayed by government and by the war. They criticized what they considered to be the over-materialism of American society in the 1920s, the obsession with the new gadgets and the new trinkets. They really mercilessly made fun of Americans and what we had become, they argued, in the 1920s. Number of famous Lost Generation writers, H.L. Mencken, F. Scott Fitzgerald, criticized the obsession with wealth in this country in books like The Great Gatsby. Ernest Hemingway focused on his criticisms of the war and the false promises of the war in books like Farewell to Arms. Sinclair Lewis made fun of Midwestern American life and our obsession with competing with each other and being seen as better or superior to our neighbors. His famous books, Babbitt and Main Street, really ridiculed or made fun of traditional rural American society. That is it, folks. Mr. M signing off. Hour and 5 minutes in the book. One more set of notes to go.